You think silence is nothing, but in reality, silence is one of the most powerful emotional forces you can ever use. Because when you stop chasing someone who is used to being chased, something strange happens in their mind. At first, they breathe. They feel the relief of space. No messages, no pressure, no emotional demands. And they tell themselves a story. This is better. I needed this distance. But what they don't realize is the human mind doesn't process emotional absence as peace for very long. It processes it as uncertainty. And uncertainty is where discomfort begins to grow. Because here's what an avoidant often relies on emotionally. Distance that is predictable. Control that is familiar. Connection that never fully requires them to fully show up. So when you go silent, not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as a real withdrawal of your energy, you interrupt their emotional pattern, and now they don't know where they stand with you. And the mind hates that. So what happens next is subtle. They don't run back immediately. No, that would be too easy. Instead, they start thinking about you in fragments. A moment here, a memory there, a random thought when they're alone. A flicker of curiosity when they see something that reminds them of you, and they tell themselves it's nothing. But it keeps happening. Because silence does something powerful. It removes access without giving closure, and that creates space for reflection, whether they like it or not. But here's the deeper truth most people miss. Your silence is not about getting them to chase you. It's about breaking your own pattern of overgiving to someone who only meets you halfway. Because the real shift doesn't happen in their behavior first. It happens in your identity. The moment you stop reaching, you start remembering your worth. The moment you stop explaining your value, you start embodying it. And ironically, that is the version of you that becomes unforgettable. Now, yes, in their mind, confusion may grow. They may wonder why you didn't come back. They may even feel a quiet sting of ego because the emotional safety net they assumed would always be there is gone. But don't build your power on their reaction. That's not transformation, that's dependency in disguise. True strength is when you can sit in silence and not need it to produce a result in someone else. Because here's the divine principle in all of this. What is meant for you does not require you to abandon yourself to keep it. And what requires you to abandon yourself was never truly love. It was attachment dressed as hope. So when you go silent, don't make it a strategy. Make it a return to your standards, a return to your peace, a return to the version of you that doesn't negotiate their worth just to be seen. Because the most powerful thing that ever happens in an avoidance mind is not that they miss you. It's that you finally stopped proving you should be missed. Avoidant individuals often feel overwhelmed by emotional intensity. And when that pressure builds in a relationship, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as love in the way a more secure person might. Instead, it gets translated internally as demand, expectation, or loss of control. And for someone who is wired around protecting their independence, control isn't just preference. It feels like emotional safety. So when things start to feel too close, too emotional, or too dependent, their first instinct is not to lean in, but to step back. What's important to understand is that this withdrawal is rarely about a lack of feeling. It's about how feeling is processed. Many avoidant individuals actually do experience emotion deeply, but they struggle with sustained emotional proximity because it activates internal discomfort they don't fully understand how to regulate. So instead of sitting with that discomfort and communicating through it, they move away from it. Distance becomes their regulation tool. Space becomes their form of breathing again. In the early stages of emotional closeness, they might even feel excitement. There is curiosity, attraction, and appreciation for connection. But as expectations grow, whether spoken or unspoken, the internal alarm system begins to activate. Even simple things like consistent texting, emotional vulnerability, or the expectation of reassurance can start to feel heavy to them over time. Not because those things are inherently too much, but because their internal tolerance for sustained emotional intensity is lower. So what happens next is subtle but powerful. They begin to create space, not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes it's delayed replies. Sometimes it's becoming less emotionally expressive. Sometimes it's focusing more on work, hobbies, or anything that reestablishes their sense of autonomy. On the surface, it may look like disinterest, but internally it's often self-regulation. They are trying to return to a state where they feel in control of their emotional world again. And here's where the dynamic becomes painful for the other person. Because the more they pull away, the more the partner often leans in. The more anxious energy enters the connection, the more overwhelmed the avoidant person becomes. This creates a cycle where emotional pursuit meets emotional retreat. One person is trying to get closer to feel secure, while the other is trying to create distance, to feel stable. But the avoidant mind doesn't frame it in relational terms at first. It frames it in personal terms. I need space. I feel pressured. I can't think clearly, or this is getting too intense. These are not necessarily judgments of the partner. They are internal interpretations of emotional overload. Their system is essentially trying to find equilibrium again. The deeper layer is that avoidant individuals often equate emotional intensity with loss of self. So when a relationship starts to feel like it requires consistent emotional availability, they may unconsciously feel like they are disappearing into the relationship. And to protect their identity, they pull back. It's not always a conscious decision. It is more like an automatic response shaped by past experiences where closeness may have felt consuming, unpredictable, or overwhelming. This is why in moments of emotional escalation, they often become less expressive, more logical, or even detached. Logic becomes a shield, silence becomes a boundary, distance becomes a form of self-preservation. They are not necessarily rejecting love itself. They are rejecting the internal experience of emotional overwhelm that they associate with losing themselves. When you go silent, especially after a period of emotional pursuit or consistent availability, it disrupts something very specific in an avoidant person's internal world. Their expectation of emotional predictability. Up until that point, there is usually a subconscious assumption that your energy will remain accessible, not necessarily in a controlling way, but in a patterned way. They become used to a certain rhythm, messages, attention, emotional presence, checking in, or even subtle reassurance. And whether they admit it or not, that rhythm becomes part of their internal baseline. So when you suddenly withdraw that presence, you don't just create distance, you interrupt a system they had quietly adapted to. And the mind does not handle broken patterns smoothly. At first, there is often a sense of relief. This is important to understand. Relief is the initial response because the pressure they may have been feeling, whether real or perceived, has been removed. The emotional noise quiets down. There are no expectations to respond to, no emotional intensity to manage, no need to regulate someone else's feelings or navigate deeper conversations they were not fully ready for. In that moment, silence feels like control returning to them. It feels like breathing space. But this is where the deeper psychological shift begins, and it's subtle. Because once the nervous system settles, the absence of your presence starts to register not as relief, but as information. And that information is something has changed. You are no longer available in the way you used to be. And this creates cognitive dissonance. On one side, their system says, "This is good, I have space." On the other side, something quieter begins to ask, "Why does this feel different?" That mismatch between relief and uncertainty is where their mind starts to engage in analysis rather than emotional reaction. Avoidant individuals are often more comfortable with emotional distance, but they are not immune to curiosity or attachment cues. When a familiar emotional pattern disappears without explanation or confrontation, the mind naturally tries to fill in the gap. It begins to scan for meaning. Did something happen? Are you upset? Have you moved on? Or are you simply no longer emotionally available in the way they assumed? This is where silence becomes powerful, not because it is loud, but because it is ambiguous. The avoidant mind is particularly sensitive to ambiguity when it involves emotional accessibility. If someone is consistently present, they can regulate their distance comfortably. If someone is fully gone, they can rationalize it and compartmentalize it. But when someone is partially present and then suddenly absent without emotional closure, it creates an unresolved loop in the mind. And unresolved loops do not disappear easily. They resurface in quiet moments. When they are alone, when distractions fade, when the nervous system is not occupied with external demands. A thought appears. It's strange that they haven't reached out. And even if they dismiss it, the thought returns later in a different form. Not as panic, but as curiosity. What makes this even more impactful is that silence removes the emotional buffer they were used to. When you were present, even if they were distancing, your presence still existed as an anchor they could return to whenever they felt ready. Your availability created an emotional safety net, but silence removes that net, and now they are left with the reality that access to you is no longer guaranteed. This is where the mind begins to reevaluate, not necessarily the relationship itself at first, but your behavior. And then gradually, the meaning behind your behavior. People often underestimate how much meaning is created in absence. When someone is constantly present, they become background. When they disappear, they become signal. And in that signal, the avoidant mind starts to reorganize its assumptions, because now they are no longer in control of proximity in the same way. And anything that removes control from an avoidant system forces attention. Not always immediately, not always emotionally, but cognitively, they start to notice the gap. They start to register the silence. And slowly, what once felt like relief begins to feel like something unfinished, unresolved, and slightly uncomfortable in a way they can't fully explain. When you go silent, one of the first internal reactions that can arise in an avoidant person is curiosity. But it's important to understand that this curiosity does not always appear in a warm or emotionally expressive way. It is often quiet, subtle, and even slightly detached at first. That's because curiosity in this context is not immediately emotional. It is cognitive. Their mind starts to register a change in pattern, and the human brain is wired to pay attention when predictable emotional rhythms are disrupted. For someone who has grown accustomed to your presence, even if they were not consistently responsive or deeply emotionally engaged, your energy still represented a known variable in their life. They knew how you showed up. They knew the general availability of your attention. They understood the unspoken pattern between you. And when that pattern suddenly stops, the brain doesn't interpret it as nothing. It interprets it as data that requires interpretation. So curiosity begins to form not from longing at first, but from disruption. It often starts with small observations, a missed message that would normally be replied to, a gap in communication that feels slightly longer than usual, a moment where they check their phone and realize there is no new interaction from you. These moments are not dramatic, but they are noticeable enough to create internal questioning. And that questioning is where curiosity is born. What are they doing is often the first thought. Not necessarily because they are emotionally overwhelmed, but because their internal model of your behavior has changed. The mind naturally tries to update its expectations when new information contradicts old patterns. So if you were previously consistent in any way, emotionally, communicatively, or energetically, your sudden silence creates a mismatch that the brain tries to resolve. But avoidant individuals do something very specific with curiosity. They compartmentalize it. They don't always sit in it fully or express it outwardly. Instead, they may distract themselves, rationalize your absence, or downplay its significance. They might say to themselves, they're probably busy, or this is normal. People have their own lives. And in many cases, that rationalization works temporarily. It helps them maintain emotional distance and preserve their sense of control. However, curiosity is not eliminated by rationalization. It is only postponed. Because curiosity, once activated by emotional inconsistency, tends to resurface, especially in quiet moments, especially when external stimulation is low. The mind has a way of returning to unresolved questions, even if they were previously dismissed. And the more your absence continues without explanation or emotional closure, the more the question shifts from casual curiosity to something slightly more persistent. It becomes less about what you are doing and more about why the pattern changed. This is where internal dialogue becomes more active. They may not express it, but they begin to mentally replay interactions. They might recall how things felt before the silence. They might compare the current absence with the previous presence. And in doing so, they start constructing meaning where there is none explicitly given. Silence is powerful here because it offers no resistance. There is no argument, no explanation, no emotional confrontation, only absence. And the human mind struggles most with unanswered absence because it forces interpretation without confirmation. For an avoidant person, this curiosity is also mixed with a subtle discomfort. Not necessarily emotional pain at first, but a sense of unpredictability. Because unpredictability means loss of control over the relational dynamic. And when control is disrupted, attention is automatically drawn to the source of that disruption. So even if they try to remain indifferent, their attention is still subtly oriented towards you. They may check indirectly, they may observe your online presence without engaging, they may notice patterns they previously ignored, not because they are emotionally surrendering, but because their mind is trying to re-establish equilibrium by gathering information. And here is the deeper layer that most people misunderstand. Curiosity is the beginning of re-engagement at a psychological level, but it does not guarantee emotional action. It is simply the mind's way of saying, something has changed, and I need to understand it. Whether that curiosity turns into reflection, emotional awareness, or reconnection depends on many other factors. Self-awareness, emotional capacity, timing, and personal history. But the important truth remains. Silence introduces a question into their mind that they cannot easily ignore, because it disrupts the assumption that you will always be emotionally accessible in the same predictable way. When you go silent, especially after a phase where there has been emotional engagement, availability, or even subtle attachment, an avoidant person can initially experience something that surprises most people: relief. But this relief is not the same as emotional fulfillment or genuine peace within connection. It is more like the nervous system exhaling after perceiving pressure has been removed. To understand this properly, you have to see how avoidant individuals often process closeness. Emotional intensity, expectations, or consistent relational demands can quietly accumulate in their internal world, even if nothing wrong is happening on the surface. It's not always about what the partner is doing incorrectly. It's about how sustained closeness feels inside their system. So when that closeness is suddenly removed through your silence, the immediate internal shift is towards space, quiet, and a sense of regained autonomy. In that moment, they are not analyzing the relationship deeply. They are simply experiencing a drop in emotional demand. There are no messages to respond to, no need to interpret tone, no pressure to reciprocate energy, no subtle expectation of emotional availability. And for a mind that associates closeness with responsibility or pressure, that absence can feel like a release. This is why at first they may not chase. This is also why many people misinterpret silence as a failure of impact. Because in the early stage, your absence does not immediately register as loss. It registers as relief from intensity. But what is crucial to understand is that relief is not a stable emotional state in this context. It is transitional. Because once the nervous system adjusts to the absence of pressure, something else begins to surface underneath it. And that something is the awareness of absence itself. At first, they may not even name it. It's not "I miss them." It's more subtle than that. It's a noticing, a gap, a shift in routine, a break in emotional pattern. The mind recognizes that something familiar is no longer present, even if that something previously felt overwhelming at times. And this is where internal contradiction begins to form. One part of them may still associate the space with comfort. It's quieter now. I can breathe. But another part begins to register that the silence is not temporary pressure. It is absence of connection. And those two interpretations begin to coexist uneasily. This creates a kind of emotional duality. On one side is relief from activation. On the other side is the beginning of uncertainty. And the human mind does not remain neutral in uncertainty for long. It tries to resolve it, so even if they are not acting on it externally, internally there is a slow shift happening. They may find themselves thinking about you in moments that are unrelated to anything emotional. They may notice the absence of your presence in situations where they would normally expect it. They may catch themselves reaching for a familiar interaction pattern that is no longer there. This is where the emotional landscape subtly changes. What was once felt as pressure is gone starts to evolve into something is missing. But because avoidant individuals are often skilled at emotional compartmentalization, they may delay fully acknowledging that shift. Instead, they may rationalize it. It's just space, it's healthy, I needed this anyway. And in many cases, those rationalizations are partly true in the immediate sense. Space can feel healthy, distance can feel stabilizing. But what is often missed is that relief from pressure is not the same thing as emotional resolution. It does not address attachment. It only quiets stimulation. So over time, as the initial relief settles, the absence becomes more noticeable. Not in an explosive emotional way, but in small internal moments where the mind recognizes a change in relational texture. The silence that once felt like breathing room begins to feel more like a blank space where something used to exist. And the key psychological tension here is that nothing is actively hurting them, but something is no longer engaging them either. That in-between state is where reflection begins to quietly form, even if it is not yet fully conscious or emotionally processed. When you go silent, one of the most interesting internal dynamics that can unfold in an avoidant person's mind is this emotional oscillation between two seemingly opposite states. I feel free, and why does this feel like a loss? And what makes this so psychologically complex is that both states can be experienced at different moments without either of them fully disappearing. They don't cancel each other out, they coexist in tension. At first, the feeling of freedom is the most accessible. This is because avoidant individuals often regulate emotional intensity through distance. So when your presence disappears, the immediate drop in emotional demand can create a sense of spaciousness. There are no expectations to meet, no emotional responses to manage, no relational tension to navigate. The nervous system reads this as relief. It is no longer in a state of subtle activation. The internal environment feels quieter, less demanding, more self-contained. In this phase, the narrative in their mind often leans toward independence. Thoughts like, I needed this space, or this feels easier, or I can focus on myself again, naturally emerge. And to some extent, these thoughts are not false. Avoidant individuals do genuinely value autonomy, and when emotional closeness begins to feel heavy or consuming, distance can feel like a return to equilibrium. But what is important to understand is that freedom in this context is not purely emotional fulfillment. It is also emotional deactivation. It is the nervous system stepping out of activation mode. And while that can feel good in the short term, it does not address the attachment system underneath it, because attachment does not disappear just because activation decreases. So as time passes, something begins to shift. The same silence that initially felt like relief starts to reveal its other side. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. The absence of your presence begins to register more clearly, not as pressure, but as missing data in their daily emotional landscape. This is where the second feeling begins to emerge, loss. But this loss is not always immediately recognized as emotional longing. It is often experienced first as subtle disruption. A moment where they expect a message that doesn't come. A habit of checking their phone that leads to nothing. A quiet pause where your presence would normally exist in some form. These micro moments accumulate, and each one introduces a small recognition. Something has changed. And now the mind begins to compare. It compares before silence with after silence. It compares emotional texture, availability, and the subtle rhythm of connection that once existed. And through that comparison, a new awareness begins to form. Not necessarily about you as a person at first, but about the absence of you as a presence. This is where emotional ambiguity becomes powerful, because the mind is now holding two experiences at once. On one side, there is relief from emotional pressure. On the other, there is the emerging awareness that something meaningful is no longer present. And the mind does not immediately resolve this contradiction. Instead, it moves between them depending on context, mood, and external stimulation. When they are busy or distracted, the freedom narrative dominates. They feel fine, independent, even relieved. But in quieter moments, when stimulation drops and the mind is left to wander, the loss narrative becomes more visible. Not necessarily as sadness, but as reflection, a subtle questioning, a noticing of absence. This back and forth creates a psychological rhythm, expansion and contraction. One moment they feel emotionally lighter, the next they become aware of something missing. And because neither state fully resolves the other, the mind continues to cycle between them. What makes this especially significant is that avoidant individuals often try to stabilize discomfort through rational explanation. So they may tell themselves that the freedom they feel is proof they made the right decision, or that the absence is simply part of normal distance. But rationalization does not eliminate emotional contrast. It only organizes it. So the oscillation continues. I feel fine without them, exists alongside. It's strange that they're not here. And over time, the emotional weight of absence can slowly increase in significance, not because anything is being forced, but because contrast creates awareness. The more clearly they experience independence, the more clearly they notice what was once part of their emotional environment. This is the quiet tension of silence. It does not push them toward you, but it prevents them from fully forgetting the space you occupied. When you go silent, one of the most psychologically significant things that begins to happen inside an avoidant person is not immediate emotional reaction. It is gradual exposure to emotional space they usually avoid sitting in. And this is where things become deeply interesting, because avoidant individuals are not just avoiding people. In many cases, they are avoiding internal states that closeness tends to activate. When connection is active, there is movement. There is interaction, distraction, response, interpretation, and constant external focus. Even if the connection feels overwhelming at times, it still provides structure. There is something to respond to, something to manage, something to think about outside of oneself. So emotional experience is constantly being processed outwardly. But when you go silent, that external structure begins to disappear. And what replaces it is space. At first, that space can feel like relief as the nervous system downshifts from activation. But as time continues, something more subtle begins to happen. Attention turns inward by default. And for an avoidant person, that inward turn is not always comfortable, because internal emotional processing is often something they have learned to minimize, bypass, or intellectualize rather than fully experience. So silence does something powerful. It removes external emotional stimulation that they could previously use as a buffer against themselves. And in that sense, they begin to sit, sometimes unknowingly, in emotional space they usually escape from. This space is not always filled with one clear emotion. It is often diffuse, a mixture of thoughts, sensations, memories, and small emotional impressions that were previously overshadowed by interaction. It might begin with something simple, a passing thought about you, then another, then a memory triggered by something unrelated. Then a moment of reflection that feels slightly heavier than expected, because when there is no external engagement pulling their attention outward, the mind naturally begins to process what remains unresolved internally. And this is where avoidant patterns become important. Many avoidant individuals have learned to move away from emotional intensity, rather than sit inside it long enough to fully understand it. So when silence removes distraction, there is a kind of forced stillness that they are not always accustomed to holding for long periods. In that stillness, feelings they normally suppress or dilute through activity begin to surface in fragments. Not in overwhelming waves necessarily, but in small signals. A sense of discomfort without clear source. A slight restlessness. a quiet awareness that something feels unfinished. These are not always consciously labeled emotions, but they are internal experiences nonetheless. And the mind, trying to make sense of this internal space, often begins to scan for explanation. Sometimes it will attribute it to external factors, stress, routine, life pressure. But the emotional residue of connection can still be present underneath those explanations. Because even when someone is avoidant, emotional bonds do not vanish simply because attention is redirected. They remain stored in memory, association, and habit. So silence does something very specific. It reduces external noise enough for internal signals to become more noticeable. This is where reflection can begin, even if it is reluctant or fragmented. They might find themselves replaying interactions without intending to, not necessarily in a romanticized way, but in an analytical way at first, trying to understand the shift, trying to locate when the change happened, trying to reconcile the difference between how things were and how things are now. And because there is no active engagement from your side to interpret, explain, or respond, their mind is left alone with the narrative it constructs. This is where emotional space becomes powerful, because space forces interpretation without confirmation. And in that interpretive space, they begin to confront something they often avoid, the internal impact of connection itself, not just what you did or didn't do, but what the connection meant in terms of emotional experience. How it affected their sense of stability, how it challenged their usual emotional regulation patterns, how it lingered even after physical or conversational distance increased. This does not always lead to immediate emotional openness or expression. In fact, in many cases, avoidant individuals may still resist fully engaging with what arises. They may distract themselves again, they may reframe the situation logically, they may minimize what they are feeling. But the key shift is that silence creates the conditions where avoidance is no longer constantly supported by external stimulation. And in that gap, even briefly, they are exposed to themselves in a way that connection previously prevented them from fully experiencing. And that exposure is where the beginning of internal reflection quietly starts to form, even if they do not yet have the language or willingness to fully name it. When you go silent, there is a part of the dynamic that most people misunderstand completely. Because their eye are focused on the other person's reaction. They are trying to decode whether the avoidant person is thinking about them, missing them, questioning them, or coming closer emotionally. But the deepest transformation is not happening in their mind first. It is happening in yours. And that shift is what ultimately changes the entire emotional structure of the connection. Because the moment you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop reaching into silence with anxiety-driven effort, something fundamental breaks in your internal pattern. You begin to withdraw your energy not from a place of strategy, but from a place of self-preservation. And whether you realize it or not, that is the moment you begin to stop abandoning yourself. In many emotionally imbalanced dynamics, especially with avoidant individuals, the other person often becomes conditioned into over-functioning. They overgive, over-communicate, over-analyze, and over-pursue in an attempt to bridge emotional distance. And over time, this creates an internal identity where worth becomes tied to effort. The more you do, the more you feel you matter. The less you receive, the more you try. But silence interrupts that cycle. At first, it feels uncomfortable because your nervous system is used to engagement. It is used to checking, interpreting, waiting, hoping. So when you stop, there is a withdrawal, not just from the person, but from the habit of attachment itself. And in that space, something begins to surface that was previously suppressed. Awareness of your own emotional participation. You start to notice things you were too emotionally involved to see clearly before. How often you were the one initiating, how much energy you were giving without equal return, how much of your peace was being outsourced to someone else's response. And this awareness is not always pleasant, but it is clarifying because silence removes the distraction of their behavior and forces you to confront your own patterns. And this is where transformation begins. You start to realize that your emotional state does not have to be dependent on whether someone chooses to show up consistently. You begin to feel the difference between connection that is mutual and connection that is maintained through your effort alone. And slowly, your standards start to rise. Not because you are trying to punish anyone, but because you are beginning to understand what emotional safety actually feels like. And here is the deeper truth. When you stop chasing, you are not just creating space for them to reflect. You are creating space for yourself to return. You return to your own center. You return to your own priorities. You return to the parts of your life that were slowly being overshadowed by emotional uncertainty. And as that return happens, your identity begins to shift from someone trying to be chosen to someone choosing themselves. This shift is powerful because it changes your energetic presence entirely. You are no longer operating from emotional scarcity. You are no longer trying to earn consistency through effort. You are no longer negotiating your worth through availability. Instead, you begin to embody a different kind of energy, one that is grounded, self-contained, and no longer dependent on external validation for emotional stability. And ironically, this is often the point where the dynamic itself begins to change. Not because you are doing something to get a reaction, but because you are no longer living in emotional imbalance. You are no longer overextending into spaces where you are not met. You are no longer filling silence with anxiety-driven behavior. You are simply no longer abandoning yourself to maintain proximity to someone who cannot meet you halfway. And this is the divine principle underneath it all. Anything that requires you to lose yourself in order to maintain it was never aligned with your wholeness. So when silence happens, yes, it may trigger reflection in them. Yes, it may create curiosity, discomfort, or awareness of absence. But the real transformation, the one that actually lasts, is the one that happens inside you. Because the moment you stop chasing someone who cannot meet you fully, you don't just change the relationship dynamic, you change your relationship with yourself. Thank you for your time and attention. May you move forward with clarity, strength, and peace. Goodbye, and take care of yourself as you continue your journey of growth and self-respect.